evening. Good evening. My name is Dr. Rasheed. I'm the African American Student Program Coordinator here at Lane Community College. And our BSU has done it again. We have another outstanding panel for a conversation that's long overdue that we're going to center here today. Okay, so first and foremost, I want to introduce us to Ms. Blakelock. Ms. Blakelock is an MA PhD student in American Studies. Her research often deals with the intersections of race, religion, and education in American jurisprudence, can I say it? With the emphasis on the impact of this intersection holds on political and societal advancement in oppression of Black Americans. Ms. Blakelock often deals with the legal strategy and the discourse used to maintain educational inequality for Black middle and high school students. Her current project explores the relationship between school choice, alternatives, educational inequality, and the characteristics of a functioning democracy. Prior to her work in graduate school, Ms. Blakelock was a general practice attorney in both Hampton Roads and Richmond, focusing primarily on labor and employment law. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Next, we have, I call him brother, but Dr. Donner, and I'm getting his, well, first, let me recognize him as the 2021 Derrick Bell Legacy Awardee. Now, he didn't want to say that, but we need to make sure we give him, a shout out for that honor. That's a huge recognition, huge honor. Associate Professor of Education, affiliated faculty in American Studies. I'm an affiliated faculty of Africana Studies. Areas of expertise, of course, critical race theory and education, race, college sports. He's a big sports fan. Qualitative research methodology, school desegregation, education policy, and civil rights in education. Let me see. So he's co-edited several books, including Scandals in College Sports, Legal and Ethical and Policy Case Studies, Critical Race Theory and Education, All God's Children, Got a Song, the second edition, and the Charter School Solution, Distinguishing Fact from Rhetoric, and the Resegregation of Schools, Race and Education in the 21st Century. Dr. Donahue has also served as a rebuttal expert in the Clark versus State of Public Charter School Authority. His research has been published in Teachers College Record, Educational Policy, Race and Ethnicity, and Education, Peabody Journal of Education, the International Journal of Qualitative Studies, and the Journal of Urban Education.
Thank you for the opportunity. Looking forward to this conversation with my esteemed colleagues. Yes.
See, I told you he's humble, very humble. And last, without further ado, but definitely not least, Dr. Marvin Lynn has actually been a participant. This is his third time blessing us with his brilliance and scholarship. So let me get into it. Dr. Lynn is an educator, scholar of higher education leader, community leader, racial equity advocate, musical artist. Currently serves as professor at Portland State University, served as dean of the College of Education at PSU from 2017 to 2021. He also served as dean of the School of Education in Indiana University, South Bend, from 2013 to 2017. As a leader, Dr. Lynn has been credited with increasing faculty, staff, and student diversity, growing enrollment, and bringing a renowned focus on equity in curriculum and faculty professional development. As a scholar, he is widely recognized as a leading expert on critical race theory and education, in the works and lives of Black male teachers, and the diversification of the educator workforce. His scholarship has been published in the leading journals in the field, including Teachers College Record, Review and Research in Education, and Urban Education. He is the lead editor of the handbook Critical Race Theory in Education, which just released its second edition. Congratulations. He has received the Interdisciplinary Analysis Award from the American Educational Research Association, the Derek Bell Legacy Award winner from the Critical Race Studies in Education Association. We have two now. And special award recognition in the contributions to the advancement of critical race theory globally in South Africa, from the University, the Free State in South Africa. He was recently recognized as one of the top 32 researchers at Portland State, most cited. Wow. Yeah, I know I cited him a lot too for my work. Researchers in the world. That's heavy. Dr. Lynn has been a featured commentator on the national and international news outlets, including the New York Times, the BBC News, Fox News, the Christian Science Monitor, Great Britain News, and more. He is an elected official in the state of Oregon, serving as the vice president of Tigard School District. Dr. Lynn is also the co-founder of the Critical Race Studies in Education, which held its 11th annual international conference this past fall.
Thank you so much, brother. It's always great to work with you, and I'm excited about working with my colleagues, Ms. Blakelock and Dr. Donner.
Ms. Blakelock, could you give us a good, foundational, working definition of critical race theory and its origin?
Sure. I think it's a very important question because often people, when they say critical race theory, no one defines it. And so people are generally talking about something that is kind of abstract. So I'm happy to give what I think is probably an oversimplification, but a quick definition. I think it's important that we are clear that critical race theory is a framework. And so it can look different in different contexts, whether you're talking about residential segregation or education or employment or the criminal justice system. That being said, I would define critical race theory as a way of examining history in the present through a critical racial lens. Foundational to this definition is the concept that one, race is a social construct, two, that it is systemic and entrenched in all of our institutions, including, if not primarily, legal institutions. And then lastly, because of the previous point, it is impossible to think of racism as an individual phenomenon, meaning that even if tomorrow all the racists were gone, we would still have systems that produce racial inequalities. Excuse me. And then as for the second part of your question, I think it's interesting that we're talking about critical race theory right now when it's not a new framework. So it's been around since the 70s and 80s, and it came out of a larger legal tradition criticizing the established idea that law was neutral. This legal tradition was the critical legal studies movement. And whereas the critical legal studies movement was focused on criticizing law as a vessel for maintaining the status quo in society, CRT focused that kind of mission on issues of racial status quo. And so that's kind of the origin. You have people like Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, who start producing this scholarship on what they see as something that has been missing since the civil rights, after we see the kind of effects of the civil rights movement. And then I don't know if this is beyond the scope of the question, but I do want to address this kind of new revived interest in critical race theory, particularly because I was reading on the Heritage Foundation's website, which, if you don't know, the Heritage Foundation is a conservative think tank group. And they, under their critical race theory tab, they define it as destructive and say that it rejects the fundamental ideas on which our constitutional republic is based. And I think that's important because the term has become kind of a boogeyman for all things racial. And if you don't believe me, from January of June to this year, Fox News has mentioned the term critical race theory over 2,000 times, not once giving a definition. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for, because I think it's important to establish a really good foundational definition of what the term is. And before I go to the other panelists, did anyone else want to add something? Because again, you all are rock stars and scholars. So if you wanted to add on or build on from what Ms. Blakelock said, you definitely could do that. If not, we could keep it pushing. So at this time, you know, Dr. Donner or Dr. Lynn didn't want to input any additional comments, we'll keep it pushing. Okay, thank you, excellent job. Thank you for that. So moving ahead. So this is a loaded question, Dr. Donner. It's loaded. So I apologize in advance, it's long. And it's two parts as well. So if you want me to be quiet and answer the first part and then go to the second part, Dr. Donner, that's fine, because it is long. So Dr. Donner and which we often call her the GOAT, Dr. Gloria Lansing Billings, Critical Race Theory and Education, the Scholar's Journey. This book right here, go get your copy. Yeah, I'm promoting us. So yeah, go ahead and get you a copy. Dr. Lynn will bring his book up later. But you want to make sure you get these books. But you have a chapter titled Critical Race Theory and Post-Racial Imaginary. Post-Racial Imaginary. In this chapter, you and Dr. Lansing Billings coined the phrase, the limits of liberal ideology. Please define this phrase. So I'm gonna stop right there before I go into the next.
Sure thing. So I don't know if we necessarily coin it. You know me, I'm always going to pay my respects to Derek Bell. So that said, by the limits of liberal ideology, we were specifically referring to seemingly benign phrases such as equal opportunity, liberty, freedom of choice. You know, these phrases that we constantly hear that supposedly represent this country's founding principles, and some would even argue our founding myths. And their inability to adequately address systemic racism and structural inequity, as well as being used as discursive narratives, policy discursive tools to not simply just paper over systemic racism, anti-Black racism and structural inequity, but then to actually perpetuate those inequities. Yeah.
All right, thank you. So now here comes the mouthful. So also in this chapter, great chapter, the whole book is fire. So also in this chapter, you convey the importance of the utilization of counter narratives. You quote Akimoto. So that to the extent that we interpret our experiences from within the master's narrative, we reinforce our own subordination. Whether people of color can counter racism may depend finally on our ability to claim identities outside the master's narrative. Okay, end quote. So in Bush and Bush's work is titled The Paradigm Shift. Just because the line is talking doesn't mean that he still isn't telling the Hunter's story. This is an African-American male theory and the problematics of both deficit and non-deficit models. Okay, shout out to Bush and Bush doing great work on African American male theory. So they asserted the following as their recommendation. So refrain from using reactionary and deficit words such as counter or other. A trend, particularly among those who employ CRT, is to use words such as counter narrative, counter storytelling, and other to describe the phenomenon of often historically excluded groups that depart from or whose perspective run perpendicular to the mainstream beliefs or discourse. This practice inadvertently links the origin and location in narratives. Again, we're talking about African American males, African American boys and men to oppression and oppressors. The story of Africans worldwide, including African American boys and men, it's not counter to any story. It just is. What say you about this recommendation?
I'm going to push back slightly against this recommendation. And in fairness, I have not read this piece. And so I'm going to give the author some grace and a benefit of the doubt in that they mean well. But that said, I will say that I disagree with the assertion on face value, just given both the legacy of anti-Black racism in this country, as well as our current political state. And so that, so that said, a question I would have for Bush and Bush would be, so would they consider the Obama presidency just a presidency? Or knowing what we know now, was it a foreshadowing of explicit white nationalism? And so again, kind of to Ms Blakelock introduction, definition of critical race theory, we also have to keep in mind when these terms, the spaces in which these terms came about. So when we're talking about counter narratives, to invoke that term, one, you're showing, demonstrating intellectual fidelity to critical race theory, right? Because remember, the whole point of counter narratives is because they allow historically marginalized groups and communities to, one, name their realities, which is essential to personhood, which I'm going to assume Bush and Bush thinks is very important. The other piece is that for me, the second piece is that it pushes back against the dominant narratives that justify racial hierarchies and structural inequities. And three, the other piece about counter narratives that often gets left out of a lot of the critical race theory work in education is that counter narratives offer possibilities of what could be and what a just society might and can look like. And so, like I said, I just want to push back a little bit. Yeah, we can say it's just a story, but to say that, do we then perpetuate the whitewashing of historically marginalized groups in the process? And some would say that's an assimilationist point of view in some ways. So yeah, I'm going to stop there.
Okay, thank you. Wow, we're off to a fire start. And the questions, we'll get a chance to address those that are in the Q&A. So we'll make sure we get to them. Again, thank you for that, Dr. Donner. So, Dr. Lynn, when I saw this post, I was like, this is a great question. So you stated on a post recently that the outcome of the Rittenhouse case is a bold and clear illustration of critical race theory's central thesis. Could you please elaborate on the statement that you posted?
Yeah, thank you. He's talking about Facebook, and Facebook for me is a tool of expression. It's one way to get the message out about a number of things. And I made that post, and I was intentional about not sort of saying, here's what I mean by that, to get kind of the conversation started. And so I'm happy to kind of talk about that. Well, there are a couple of things that I thought about and that I was thinking about when I made the post. As you know, Dr. Rasheed, I've been spending a lot of time talking to sometimes very conservative media about this entire drama that then I think the person is sort of Tracy is asking us to speak to, right? Sort of where did all this come from, and why is there so much focus now on critical race theory? And I think I'll just say it's political. It is the conservative right's way of winning back the White House, right? And so critical race theory essentially, I think, as Ms. Blakelock said, has become the boogeyman. But this is not the first time we've had a racialized boogeyman used by those who are interested in political gain. I think about the welfare queen trope of the 80s. I think about Willie Horton of the 70s or late 60s. And as Black people, we have sort of had to deal with this stuff for over and over again. And I think we get sort of brought up as an example of what needs to change about society, right? So we understand that ultimately what this is about is making America great again. But let's get out of politics and talk about the question that you asked me. One of the things that CRT focuses on is this critique of the law itself, right? I think critical race theorists argue, and this goes against what legal scholars learn, right? What legal scholars learn is that the law is objective and that it is unbiased, right? And what critical race theorists have said time and time again, that is not the case, that in fact, race and racism are constituted in the law, and that the legal system is absolutely racially biased, and we can see that based on the outcomes. And so this key principle in CRT, that the law is not objective or biased or unbiased, that is not neutral, I think was made really evident with this Rittenhouse case, because it was a clear example of the way I would say racial and gender bias works to impact the legal system and to protect the interest of white men and boys, right? And you can decide for yourself whether you think Rittenhouse was a man or a boy. I'm going to use both terms just to cover the whole thing. And to that end, I think Kimberly Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality is also evident here, because while I emphasize this notion of intersectional oppression, right, where we look at how racism then sort of is connected to patriarchy and sexism to create a unique set of experiences for Black women. This is what Crenshaw's talking about. But in this case, what we have is intersectional privilege, right? So we're talking about white men and boys who, because of their race and their gender, because I don't know that it would have turned out the same way for a white woman. I don't know that to be the case. That who are privileged, the red carpet is essentially rolled out for this young man by the judge, who actually interferes in this case, and it doesn't even allow the prosecution to make a strong case, right? And paves the way for what we saw happen. So, this is a clear illustration of our justice system is broken, and I think. It gets back to this point that critical race theories have been making all along about bias and racism encoded in the law, but also manifested in the way the criminal justice system itself functions and operates on a daily basis.
Okay. All right.
If I can,
oh, wait.
If I can,
go ahead. I'm gonna go to Ms. Blakelock, and then I'm gonna go to you, Dr. Donner.
Okay.
Just wanted to piggyback a little bit, just because as a person who went through law school, that is 100% correct. When we learn about the way that law proceeds from one generation to the next, it's all about the rational, objective person. Every concept is about this kind of so-called objective man. So even that in its language is gendered. But I think one key point that I just wanted to bring up that kind of connects to the reason why terms like counter narrative is so important is because when we move away from the fact that law is not not neutral, that it's not objective, then we can actually more adequately look at power structures. And so, for example, one thing I always think about is in the Constitution, everyone always talks about the Fifth Amendment. The great thing about due process is protection of property. But when you look at what was going on, what property were they most concerned about protecting, right? So like even in some of our most high esteemed democratic ideals, slavery and racism are incorporated in those principles. So that's all I just wanted to add.
Oh, no, thank you. Dr. Donner?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to add or build on Dr. Lynn's point with respect to the Rittenhouse case. And actually, there's a very class component that that's very subtle in this. And what I mean is, and I didn't realize this until I read the op-ed by the legal scholar Paul Butler at Georgetown University, where Rittenhouse legal fees were funded, by GoFundMe. And so here's the irony, and I hope somebody does a paper on this. One of the ironies of Rittenhouse and his defense team is that one of his lawyers was a lawyer for O.J. Simpson, right? And so we're talking about for you to be able to afford to pay O.J. And so Rittenhouse had like $2 million just dedicated by volunteers to fund his legal team, right? And so one of the other things that money allowed his legal team to do was run 2 separate mock trials and hearings. And one would determine, and it was used as a strategy to determine whether or not he would go on the witness stand and testify. And so again, there's race, but let's talk about money, capitalism, and how that then also perpetuates racial inequality, white hegemony, white supremacy.
Absolutely. And I think that when you look at the experiences of Black and Brown and Indigenous folks in the legal system, it is mainly about that issue, right? The lack of capital that people are bringing to be able to afford these very expensive lawyers. And so another inherent bias, I think, within the system.
Wow, that's just round one. So we hold on to your sock, folks. So we're gonna this is definitely gonna titillate you. So we're gonna queue up a video before I see Ms Blakelock laughing. Before we get to Ms Blakelock, next question. So I'm gonna cue that up, and I'm pretty sure you may have some visceral reactions after you see and hear this.
Do I have to?
Yes, Randy.
Thank you very much. Critical race theory is being forced into our children's schools. It's being imposed into workplace trainings, and it's being deployed to rip apart friends, neighbors, and families. For many years now, the radicals have mistaken Americans' silence for weakness, but they're wrong. There is no more powerful force than a parent's love for their children, and patriotic moms and dads are going to demand that their children are no longer fed hateful lies about this country. The left is attempting to destroy that beautiful vision and divide Americans by race in the service of political power. By viewing every issue through the lens of race, they want to impose a new segregation, and we must not allow that to happen. Today, I'm also pleased to announce that I will soon sign an executive order establishing a national commission to promote patriotic education. It will be called the 1776 Commission.
Okay, so I'm pretty sure people are salivating to offer some comments and opine about that clip. But Ms. Blakelock is first. So aforementioned, your current project explores the relationship between school choice, alternatives, educational inequities, inequalities, and the characteristics of a functioning democracy. To that end, have you seen a can I say the word proliferation of school choice alternative that fosters this 1776 mantra, kind of like for like this chauvinistic educational foundation?
Okay, so first I have to say my favorite part of that clip is the line where he says the left is attempting to destroy that beautiful vision and divide Americans by race in the service of political power. And I want to be like, yeah, the CRT is saying that people are trying to, race in service of political power. I just thought that was interesting. It's almost a parody. But to your specific question, so I want to address this in two ways. First, I'm going to talk about school alternatives, but I also think that this is a good opportunity to talk about what the impact of this kind of rhetoric has been on both public school education and politics. So yes, in the last year from 2020 to 2021, there's been a huge increase in both homeschooling and private school education choices. The New York Times and the Washington Post have all had articles about different reasons why. I think it's something like 11% more parents have chosen to homeschool their kids in the last year than ever before. And the thing is, most of that has been attributed to the pandemic, which makes sense. A lot of parents, either their kids were struggling with virtual learning, or they realized they could teach their kids at home, whatever the reason. But there is some research that this kind of fear of what's in the curriculum has always been a motivating factor for parents who keep their children home or make alternative school choices. The point that I want to highlight, though, is that this increase in homeschooling is not exclusively a white parent phenomenon. Black parents have also started to homeschool their kids at record rates. Interestingly, it's because of the opposite reason, though. So because they feel that race isn't being adequately taught in the schools, or because their children are struggling in ways that are unique to their identity as Black children that isn't adequately being protected in public schools. So in a way, alternative school choices are being taken both in response to movements like the 1619 Project, as well as movements like Trump's 1776 Project. But the real interesting thing to me, anyway, is this kind of the proliferation of this rhetoric in the political process at large. So one thing that Trump mentions in this clip is this kind of importance of parental choice and parents' love for their children's education. And what we know is that that kind of phraseology, that kind of language has been used as a vehicle for anti-Black educational policymaking since Brown. The Supreme Court has consistently valued parental choice to the exclusion of desegregation and educational equality initiatives, mainly because it proclaims to be neutral, right? It's not about Black parents, it's not about white parents, it's about the fact that parents are invested in their children, and parents should have that right to make the choice. So when Trump invokes this language, he's not doing it just because, he's doing it for a reason. And the reason is to enrage and motivate white suburbia. It has real political implications. I don't know if you guys know, but in Virginia's recent state elections, one of the big positions for the Republican governor candidate was a commitment to valuing parental choice in curriculum selection. He even said on his first day, he would sign an executive order banning CRT. Whether he can legally do that or not that's in question. But exit polls, especially in places in Northern Virginia, a place that generally usually comes out Democratic, consistently over and over, one of the main reasons suburban voters said that they chose him over the Democratic candidate was for this education curriculum piece. So I think it's important to realize that this strategy has teeth. It's worked in the past, it's working in the present. Unless something changes, it's likely to continue to work in the future. Also, and I'll do this quickly, but if people have questions, I'm happy to answer. I think we should also talk about the number of state laws that have been passed that or proposed in the last year regarding critical race theory. So 9 states have passed laws that either ban critical race theory specifically or controversial racial opinions, and 19 have proposed similar bills. And really important is that these are not just Southern states. So there are quite a few in the Northeast, Maine, New Hampshire, and a lot in the Midwest. And so that's something to think about, especially since a lot of these laws extend beyond the scope of education, banning certain types of diversity trainings, along with teaching and training about issues related to sex and gender. And like I said, I have more details about those if anybody's interested, but I just wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Any of you brothers wanted to jump in on anything else, or are we going to keep it moving? I saw a lot of head nodding. And okay, you just had the amen corner. Okay, we will keep it pushing. So and again, I apologize to Dr. Donner. I given me these loaded, long, many thesis questions. But that article or that chapter was so good. I mean, again, the whole book is great. So, Dr. Donner, in that same chapter, you stated, and I quote, "The notions of cultural deprivation and cultural disadvantage and the more recent notion of cultural poverty flow directly from the beliefs about whiteness. White supremacy and Black inferiority, even African-American social scientists like Kenneth Clark were combined in the paradigmatic use of social science that represented the African-American as inferior. Clark, in his famous doll studies, demonstrated the deleterious effects of segregation, but also reinforced the idea that Black culture in of itself was disadvantaged. Rather than attack race as the destructive concept that crowded out culture, Clark's work contributed to the ideology that made race and culture synonymous," end quote. So extending onto this premise, of course, William Cross, Shades of Black, Diversity in African-American Identity, challenges this notion of Black inferiority, self-hatred, and pathology, concluded in Clark's study. That being said, what are the ways in which critical race theory can be utilized to further affirm Black people without the paternalistic assistance of white people?
Great question. And I will try to unpack that as much as I can. But first, let me start by saying, I think it's a general consensus now that the Clark study was fundamentally flawed. But I will say, I think, he worked with the tools with what he had. But also, I think, when we think about Brown and kind of, why critical race theory, how critical race theory came into existence, I think he was trying to play on the morality of white folks. And so I'm just going to leave it there. But to your question, one of the ways in which CRT can be utilized to affirm Black people without the paternalistic assistance of white people is by, one, continuing to push back the deficit tropes, push back against the deficit tropes of cultural deprivation, cultural disadvantage, and culture of poverty in general, because they're not going away, right? They're not going away. And those that are, as well as those that are explicitly used in the service of justifying white supremacy, white patriarchy, and objectivity. So, for example, one of the things that Dr. Billings and I tried to emphasize toward the end of our chapter, Critical Race Theory in a Post-Racial Imaginary, is that yes, counter-narratives are cool, but let's not forget to examine and consider the home of some of America's social policies and where they come from and who were the individuals backing, drafting, and crafting those policies. And so what I mean by that, take for example, there's a lot of discussion, rightfully so, of how the federal government, in partnership with private industries, most notably Black banks, discriminated against Black veterans with the VA home loans. And again, we see that now, but we need to take that conversation a step further, particularly in moving it in the current climate, current context as well, by pointing out that the affirmation is responsible for the inability of Blacks to accumulate and transfer wealth across generations. So when we talk about this Black-white wealth gap, it just didn't, this isn't new. It didn't come out of nowhere, but it came out of a series of decisions from the past this prologue, that are still affecting us today. And so just to kind of link it to the present, is also responsible for what Latson-Billings calls the educational debt, in which over the course of decades and centuries, the cumulative effect of racism, particularly anti-racism, not only anti-Black racism, not only adds up, but eventually becomes invisible. Again, so it's one thing that Black veterans were discriminated. They couldn't buy homes, they couldn't, transfer intergenerational wealth. But then that also, we look at it now in terms of access to good schools. So that, it's kind of a both, and these things are inextricably linked. So to circle back to my points, critical race theory tells us that there's no such thing as the invisible hand of the free market, but rather a constellation of factors, including anti-Black racism, self-interest, and white supremacy.
Okay. Wow. Well said. Thank you for that. Yeah, there's been some push on the Clark study, and for obvious reasons, right? But I like the way you framed it. The Clarks, they did what they did at that time and what they had to utilize it with. So we're not going to pathologize them in their work. So Dr. Lynn, now I have a mini thesis for you. So again, you have done a significant amount of research centering Black male teachers. And of course, this is how I first came across your work as well. You are also, again, one of the preeminent scholars on critical race theory within education, and I would say at large. And, excuse me, in your article, right? This is one of the many of your great piece of work. In your article, Critical Race Theory in the Perspective of Black Men, Teachers in Los Angeles Public Schools, you stated, I love this quote, Black men see teaching as an opportunity to correct social, political, and even economic wrongs. Perhaps this is why the majority of them identify themselves as change agents, role models, or father figures. That said, why has there been, and I quote around this, why has there been liminal interest convergence, end quote, between Black male educators in school and school districts?
Thank you for that question. This is a big question, but I think it gets this problem that you identify. The lack of a presence of Black men in the teaching profession. I think it illustrates, I think, a whole lot of things, and I'll talk about that. But first of all, the teaching profession, as it was designed, was never designed or structured for really anybody but white women. Zeus Leonardo and his colleague Pasish have a chapter in the Handbook of Critical Race Theory in Education where they talk about the sort of structuring of the teaching profession around the interest and skill sets of white women, right? And so, when you have a profession designed for a particular class of folks, it's going to be hard for other folks to get access. So that's the first thing. And I think when we think about and we talk about teacher education programs, of which I don't know to what extent Dr. Donahue has participated, but I've been involved in them pretty much all my career. And my research talks about the disincentives that I think are created for Black males to even pursue teaching as a profession. They are discouraged from applying because of the way teaching is defined as a women's profession. A lot of Black men who apply to or seek it or express an interest in being elementary or preschool teachers who will have their sexuality questioned, right? Or their motives questioned. They are assumed to be pedophiles. And unfortunately, some of this sort of thing happens to white men also. So there's a feminization of the profession that I think keeps men really of all backgrounds, but especially Black men, out. The other thing that I think is particularly concerning regarding Black men, and Gene Matson and Ritumzi Mabakela talk about this in their work, is that because of the way Black men are viewed in society more broadly, right? When we think about plantation societies where slavery is the sort of bedrock, there's a particular way in which Black folks have been framed. And I would argue that Black men were framed as lazy, but also as violent, right? And so after slavery ended, you had to have patrols to keep Black men in Black bodies contained and in check because of this quote unquote innate violence, which was really just an excuse for the violence that was being erected upon Black men. And so this image of Black men as violent, I think, follows them into the classroom. And we see the impact that has in terms of the school to prison pipeline, right, for Black boys, the expulsion rates, the suspension rates that we see for Black boys. But we also see that for Black adults of a wide variety of professions, but especially teaching. If you take a Foucauldian analysis to look at school, Foucault talks about schooling as a panopticon, as a sort of place where kids are to be observed and socially controlled, right? And so that doesn't sort of jive really well with this notion of the Black male as this sort of violent, out of control individual. And so we have a lot of things interacting all at once. And I think Black men simply don't feel it is a welcome space for them. Now, one of the things I had a chance to do was study some really outstanding brothers who are, in fact, teaching. Some of those brothers are still teaching, and I did that work in the 90s. In fact, I talked to one of them rather frequently. And one of them went on to become a school principal. And so they were able to withstand, all of the psychic violence that they and their students experience, and sort of carve out a space within their classroom, within their school community, to do good work. And so this idea that teaching is a form of transformation, is a form of community change, they really believe that. And they were able to withstand the forces that came against them to stay in the profession. So that's an important story too, because I don't want to discourage people from considering teaching, but people need to understand that the broader forces are unfortunately discouraging, but that there are ways in which some of these brothers have managed to stay in the profession and to be very successful, and to help a lot of students move past some of these issues that I would outline.
Excellent. I was going to ask you something, but I'm gonna save it because that's part of some research that I'm doing, and I think we've spoken about this off camera, but I'll just say this. I think there's an unfortunate bifurcation that's being made for our brothers who, from different spectrums of orientations, right? And I think that's unfortunate because we only make up 2%. And so for me, I don't care what your orientation, lifestyle are and everything. We need brothers from different spectrum, different walks of life, so on and so forth. And I think your work, that work that I quoted, it kind of showed that. And I understand the work that's looking at some of the ways in which there's been kind of like this macho type of man that's placed in education. And yes, that we all could agree that may have been the case, but I don't think every brother who's trying to be an educator, fits that particular mold. And so again, there's been several, a lot of scholarship that's speaking to that. What I'm trying to get at is that, yes, we could have, both and have a conversation, but not trying to exclude anyone, right? And I think that's the conversation that we could have. I see some people smiling, so let's keep pushing.
Well, let me just say this, and I've acknowledged this publicly, but when I did my research in the early 90s, mid 90s, I was trying to get Black men into the conversation. There are a number of books and articles on Black teachers, but Black men were largely absent from the conversation in general. And so I was one of the first people. There were some other folks, I think, who did some work. There's a brother out of the University of Wisconsin. There's Vernon Polite, the late Vernon Polite was also the dean, but he studied Black male teachers. So there were some folks who had been doing this work, but it was still very limited. And I just, as a person who was really steeped in the literature, I just wasn't seeing enough of a presence of Black men. And then as we start to talk about what constitutes culturally relevant teaching, that there doesn't seem to be a lot of Black male sort of perspective and presence in that conversation either. So I have a piece that I wrote in the Teachers College Record that sort of tries to say, here's sort of how these Black men see this, and here's how they're articulating a kind of culturally relevant teaching. And I remember walking into an AERA session. The AERA is the leading research association for our profession. And Jackie Irvine was giving a paper and was quoting me because I described these men as other fathers. Black feminists describe Black women teachers as other mothers, right? And so I was drawing on that term, used that to describe Black men. And she was talking about how important it is to have a balance in terms of men and women's perspectives. But I didn't deal with the issue of really gender identity, really, or sexuality, really, because it wasn't necessarily a big issue for the men I was studying. But I was really happy to see work come along by people like Ed Brockenbrough, who was dealing very explicitly with the sort of intersection of race, gender, and sexuality, and basically pushing back on my work and saying, you didn't really pay attention to this, right? And we need to be thinking about this. We can't assume that all these men are straight or that they have to be in order to be in the classroom. So I think that's a really, really important point that you're making.
No, Brockenbrenner's work definitely addresses that. And, the other fathering piece, I think is crucial. And, again, I think there's room for the conversation, and again, my concern is that hopefully we don't eliminate, other parts or have this bifurcation where it's like, it's us against them. And this is the way. And I don't think that's the attempt, but if we're not careful, of course, we know we can have some unintended results.
That's right.
So thank you for that. That's oh my goodness, this is great. So back to my final question. I'm pretty sure the audience has several. To Ms. Blakelock. So in Richard Delgado's Liberal McCarthyism, I love the title. Liberal McCarthyism in the Origins of Critical Race Theory, he illustrates how four radical professors who were very influential in the establishment of critical legal studies and CRT lost their jobs, quote, due to the liberal, not conservative pressure and action. So one of the tenets of critical race theory is the critique of liberalism. With that being said, what are some of the ways in which CRT scholars and educators supportive of CRT can navigate safely without career repercussions or political reprisals?
Thank you for that question. I'm going to give an answer, but then I'm also going to ask my other colleagues to give their perspective as tenured professors. But this is something that I think about often as a person who will be on the academic job market sooner rather than later. And when I went back and read this article, And so the first thing that I thought about is the fact that Delgado is writing this in 2009. And so I feel like there is something a little bit different about the environment concerning CRT debate in higher education and when he was writing this. That being said, it's still a genuine concern. See, for example, Duke's decision not to tenure Nicole Hannah-Jones, who created the 1619 Project. But what her story and even the story of the 4 radical professors show us is that just because you don't get a job at maybe a liberal elite university, they still all had successful careers. And she has a successful career now at Howard. So I think one solution is to just go where they want you. And it may not be an elite liberal academy, but you can still do good work outside of, Ivy, and one thing that I think about often is just being the best at what I do, because I think there is something to, some of the most outspoken CRT people, I think about Kimberly Crenshaw, has a very successful academic career and she does not mince words. So, so I think that being the best at what you do is another solution to this problem. And then you in the question you also asked about political reprisals, and I wonder if it is for people who are interested in politics, if maybe this tension is a little bit stronger, because in some ways, right, what we've learned in the last few years is that you have to play the game a little bit when you're involved in politics. So my advice in that situation is just to think of ways to be strategic. I think you can strategically act on your convictions. And I'm not saying to be fake, but I think if you're involved in politics, the goal is to win and then do the work. So I guess that's the answer that I will leave with.
Okay, so she invited you other 10-year rock star scholars to add in on that. So it was like a request. So go ahead. And I can repeat the question if necessary.
I'll go ahead and give a stab at it. I think Ms. Blakelock, she hits on all the right points in terms of you have to be good at what you do. And so I feel like if your work is type 1, they can't really argue with you. They can in theory, but 1, that means you're doing a good job. I'll just use myself as an example, as someone who wrote a piece in the conversation about dilemmas of Black valedictorians and how the responses I got, were crazy. Like it got to the point where I literally needed police protection. Like I had plainclothes cops outside of my classrooms. I've had to kind of reorient, how I move, but it's just like, wow, y'all are really scared of these ideas. And so on the one hand, tenure does afford you a large latitude. But again, what I always like to tell people, tenure does not mean you have a job for life. Let's be clear. You can be a tenured professor and still get fired for inappropriate conduct, for misuse of funds. So I think that's one of the things we need to recognize and get out there. Yes, tenure means you have to have due process. Like they just can't arbitrarily fire you, but you can still get fired. So again, if you do the work, you're gonna have your critics. But that's why I would also say that having a strong support network is really good, not just at home, but colleagues at your home institution and colleagues outside of your home institution are really critical. And, I'll just end with this, mentors. If you are able to have mentors, that eventually become friends, please do that, because I can't speak enough about the mentors in my life.
Well, I'm glad you didn't go off too much, because that's the next question I have. You was about to steal my thunder for my question. And speaking of the case, the Cleveland case and the Fisher, but we're gonna go on that to the next one. But Dr. Lynn, did you want to add on too?
Yeah, just to say, tenure is under attack right now. And so we need to keep that in mind. I think that the same forces who are trying to stymie conversations around race in the classroom and elsewhere, who are trying to also sort of turn back the time on voting rights, are also trying to make sure we don't wear masks. I mean, there's a connection here, right, in terms of the discourse, but also the actions of these folks. And one of the things that I think they have on their docket is tenure. In Georgia is doing some very interesting things right now in terms of requiring tenured professors to go under or review every 3 to 5 years or something like that. I forget what the length of time is on that, but they're giving those institutions of higher education pretty broad latitude in terms of how to react to a bad post-tenure review. Tenure is definitely under attack. And so as the good brother said, we are under no illusion that we have a permanent job because of it. And as I think we were talking offline, you are constantly under attack in one way or another, right? And I've been a dean. I was a dean for 10 years, so I definitely know what that's about.
Yes.
That's all I'll say about that. Okay?
Yeah, yes, I can imagine. Real quickly, as you all were expressing your thoughts to this question, opining, I was thinking about Michelle Foster's work, on Black teachers, and we see what happened to those Black educators, after the Brown decision, everything. I'm thinking about, maybe about 7 to 10 years ago in Chicago, and Dr. Lynn, you know about this, what happened to those tenured teachers, K-12 teachers, that were just removed. I mean, for the most part, when you're a K-12 educator and you're tenured, unless, like you said, Dr. Donahue, unless you do some egregious, right, you're just not going to be removed. And we see things like this happening, historically, right? We see it happen in New Orleans, right? And the impacts on Black teachers in particular, just the removal of these teachers with the requisite skills and credentials, so on and so forth. And some with even advanced degrees, right? Masters and so on and so forth, being systemically removed from the classroom. And so, yeah, it's just something. Go ahead.
Can I? Yeah, I just want to jump in on that because I think this is also one of the reasons why these kind of conversations are so important, because those laws that I was talking about, a lot of them are targeted at teachers who choose to teach controversial racial opinions. And so who are the teachers that tend to have these like culturally sensitive lesson plans, right? They're people who are Black and brown and who have lived these experiences and want to educate the next generation. They see themselves, as you said, Dr. Lynn, earlier, as change agents. And so I think that, we've talked about how all of these things are connected, but this kind of stuff that's happening at the local school board level is very connected to getting rid of teachers who don't maintain the status quo. For example, I was talking to local school board members here, and the current thing is they don't teach CRT in schools. I should have brought that up too. That's not a thing that happens in K-12 schools really. But what Virginia has done over the last 3 years is started to incorporate more diverse training of their teachers, mandating that they learn how to be culturally sensitive, that they broaden the way that they teach history. And basically while CRT won't be taught in the school, these kind of advancements are going to be rolled back.
No, absolutely.
Brother, can I say one thing?
Go ahead, Dr. Lynn. Absolutely.
When you look at Virginia, it's very interesting because I was in Kentucky and was looking at sort of the way the law is taking shape there. And then I've been involved in a case in Oklahoma. Actually, the ACLU is suing the state of Oklahoma because of this law. And I wrote a brief for that case. And so I looked at Virginia, and I was surprised to learn that the state Department of Education there does, in fact, draw on some of the CRT principles as a way to sort of frame a conversation about race and racism and the necessity for teaching teachers about it and providing professional development, but also why it needs to be sort of addressed in the classroom. And I think what they did was they contracted with somebody who was an expert in multicultural education and who brought sort of a CRT lens to bear in the kind of the construction, I think, of a framework for that entire state. And so what happened is Christopher Rufo, who really is responsible for all of this, let's just be clear, he's the one who got Trump to write that initial executive order. And he is the one who's been writing the template for the state laws that are being passed, as Professor Blakelock said, Ms. Blakelock said, in 9 states and being considered the 19 more. So you got this vigilante, so to speak, who is basically raising concerns, and he engaged in this sort of Twitter storm about Virginia, and then linked, sent all these links to the Virginia Department of Education pages, which in fact do very explicitly call attention to issues of race and racism in the history of that state, and are trying to do right by those Black and Brown and Indigenous kids. So, I thought, like, okay, so there's some truth in that, right? In terms of the state's effort to try to bring those issues to bear and using the critical race framework in which to do so. The question is whether or not you believe it, right? And whether or not you believe that's the truth or you believe a different truth. And I think what Trump was so good at doing is sort of bringing up this notion of alternative facts or alternative truth. And so the truth is whatever you believe it is. It has nothing to do with history, and it doesn't need to be documented. It's just what you think it is at the time. And I think that's just the moment that we're in. And I think that speaks to the issues that I think Ms. Blakelock was raising.
No, absolutely. Thank you for that. Real quickly, just to add on to all of this brilliance, coming from the panel, if I can, I think, the work, what's kind of lost or maybe not lost in this is curricula, right? Curriculum. And of course, I referenced Dr. Brown, so Brown and Brown's work, Strange Fruit Indeed, right? And so looking at how Texas, of all states, the ways in which they try to soften a lot of the racial violence towards Black folks, right? And, the soft language and how, they're like, these are just anomalies, and, Brown and Brown did an excellent job. I definitely recommend you look at that piece, especially, they use, I think, critical race memory. I forget the framework, CRT and race memory, but they really did a good job of exposing what we're talking about now. You know what I mean? Looking at the curriculum and what's to be omitted and what can be put in. And so when we're talking about this like 1776 project, it's like, okay, let's just make sure we're being thorough, right? That we're putting it all in there. I mean, I remember when I was teaching middle school in the Bay Area, and this was one of just a publisher, it was an anthology, and they were talking about Harriet Tubman. And I was just reading from I didn't add any, I didn't bring any self-equipped material in or anything like that, just from the anthology. And I got in trouble because one of the white parents came in, the mom said, "What are you teaching this?" I'm like, this is from the anthology. I mean, so it's just like, are you kidding here? But we see that this is really a pushback on what is to be taught and what is not to be taught. And I thought the whole clip of the 1776 was interesting. I want to ask you all this bonus question, because there's this 1776 where our Black scholars are in on this. Now these are, you have people like McWhorter, all these folks who are really pushing on this 1776. I call it the Black 1776. What are your thoughts about that? I know, have you run across this? I just thought it was interesting. Just those, it's the typical Black conservative scholars who are really pushing this, I call it, again, the Black version of 1776. Any thoughts on that before we go to the next question?
Well, there's been a rich history of Black conservatism in America, right? And John McWhorter, there's a couple of other folks
Lowry, yeah.
Glenn Lowry is another one, and they're actively engaged in this conversation about why we shouldn't be talking about race in the way that we're trying to talk about it, right? And they are apologists really for white conservative America, as far as I see it. They certainly have a right to have an opinion. I just disagree.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'll just add, in addition to them being apologists, I'm going to be even more frank and call them opportunists. I mean, there's a big bag to be had as a Black conservative, just in terms of quote unquote clout, as well as, getting money associated with it. And so that's not to say that these individuals don't believe what they're writing, what they're espousing, but, there's some opportunism there. There's some opportunism there. If you want to call it, they're in a sunken place as well. I'm all for that. I'm all for that, but I'll stop there.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Not to just simply co-sign everything, but I always, when I hear this question, I think about Candace Owens, just because we're around the same age, and we could have had very similar trajectories. And so I think there's also a little bit of desire for acceptance too, that gets left out of these conversations. It is sometimes exhausting to be aware of all of the racial implications and hurdles that we face. And so in some ways, I think it's easier to assimilate. It's easier to kind of make these kind of Black conservative arguments, because you can, for the time being, while they allow you, believe that those things are true. So that's just the piece I wanted to add.
Can I just say one more thing to that? I have 3 boys, all of whom I am thankful are academically inclined. They're also athletic. And they have different views. Not all of them are critical race theorists like me, right? I have one child who he leans a little bit more conservatively, right? And it's not any of the things that we talk about in terms of why that is the case. I think part of it for him is having led a pretty privileged life and not really having had to deal with the struggles of being Black and poor, right? He's been very privileged, with a dad who's a professor and/or a dean, and his mom is a nurse and she does well. And so he's had a lot of economic privilege. He's also been surrounded by all of his schooling has been among white folks, right? And so limited exposure to Black people in a lot of ways. And I've worked hard to try to shift that, but because of the choices we've made in terms of where we've lived and where they've gone to school, that's just been what they've been exposed to. And so you see conservatism emerging sometimes kind of naturally based on people's experiences. And I think that definitely is the case for one of my kids. We do our best to try to make sure he's well informed. And that that if he's going to argue a position, that he's got real strong evidence for that before he does so. So it's a natural phenomenon that I think develops out of one's own experience as well.
And Dr. Lynn has a beautiful family, wonderful wife, 3 outstanding young men who I had the pleasure of meeting on several occasions. So just phenomenal. So, and they're funny and smart and all the things, handsome brothers. So yes. When I heard Dr. Donner, he was talking, I was thinking about Derek Bell's The Rules of Racial Standing. And that's what I think about when I think of some of our conservative scholars. I think they fall, I think he was directly talking about them when he did that particular chapter. Okay, so I teased it out. Dr. Donner, so could you briefly juxtapose the Shepherd versus Cleveland case and the Fisher versus University of Texas case? In addition, what particular CRT tenet is undergirded in both of those cases?
Sure thing. So with the Shepard v. Cleveland case, it has to do with the African-American female, Miss Jasmine Shepard, in Cleveland, Mississippi, where she filed a lawsuit against school administrators for reversing the decision to name her as the valedictorian of her graduating class. And so what's really important about this is that Miss Shepard would have been the first Black valedictorian at her high school, of all places in Mississippi, right? So that's the one piece. The other piece is that upon revoking the privilege that she earned, she was named co-valedictorian with a white female student who was allowed to take classes that other students in the school district did not know about. So that wrongfully inflated her grade point average, thus making her quote unquote co-valedictorian. With respects to the Fisher v. University of Texas case, it was a quote unquote reverse discrimination lawsuit filed by a white female claiming that the reason that she wasn't admitted to the University of Texas at Austin, which is the flagship institution of Texas, was because of its diversity policy. Keep in mind, having read, looked at the policies, but also looking at her academic transcripts, because, one of the beauties of law, particularly when you file lawsuits, they call it discovery. And so you have to supply all kinds of data, and it's on the record. And so, looking at her GPA, to say it was mediocre is to be generous, right? But so you have that piece. So she didn't, in Texas, they have the top 10% law, where if you graduate in the top 10% of your class, you're automatically admitted into UT Austin and Texas A&M. So there's that piece. But what really makes this case fascinating, and you talk about privilege and audacity, she declined the university's offer of provisional admission, which required her to participate in their summer enrichment program. So you have these two things where you didn't have the chops to get in on your own, and you're going to decline the university's provisional offer, but you're gonna blame the diversity policy. You're gonna blame this Black and brown folks, lesser qualified, getting in. But one of the other fascinating pieces is that the individual who helped bring this case to the Supreme Court, he's been on this kick for years. He's been a staunch anti-affirmative action individual. He was a key player in the Shelby v. Holder case. And as my esteemed colleague, Ms. Blakelock knows, he's also a key member of the Federalist Society. So in terms of the particular CRT tenets undergirding both cases, in the Shepard case, it was both Derek Bell's rules of racial standing and Cheryl Harris's whiteness is property. Whereas in the Fisher case, I used Lopez's strategic racism. And so for the Shepard case, I argued that it was the prospect of Ms. Shepard becoming Cleveland High School's first African-American valedictorian, which triggered local whites' deep-seated fear, i.e. Negrophobia, that if ever provided with an equitable opportunity to academically compete, Black people would actually prove themselves to be intellectually equal, thus diminishing the reputational and property value of their whiteness. And more specifically, as it relates to Derek Bell's rules of racial standing thesis, I use it to explain the judge in this case, Judge Deborah Brown, the irony in her decision to dismiss Ms. Shepard's lawsuit with prejudice, despite her 2016 ruling in a school desegregation case in the same county, Cowan v. Bolivar County, which was a school desegregation case that came out 11 years after Brown 2, not Brown 1. And so in this case, Cowan v. Bolivar County, basically the district, and when I say the district, the white school leaders, white school administrators were never in compliance. So you're talking about for over 50 years, they were able to delay school desegregation. And here you have a white judge saying enough is enough. Y'all, we're going to consolidate schools. And so to have this same judge on the one hand point out, this egregious act of resistance by the part of white folks, but then to dismiss this Black woman's case with prejudice, I think it's just a little something more than ironic. And so that's where Cheryl Harris's Whiteness is Property was able to help me elucidate how the verdict vests area whites' interests in the based assumption that no matter what, Cleveland High School remains reputationally remembered as a white school. So in other words, Shepard v. Cleveland is an exemplar of the judicial system's dualistic capability to simultaneously minimize the desperate treatment of African Americans and uphold the historically based expectations of racial dominance associated with de jure segregation and white supremacy writ large. And let me wrap this up in saying, with respects to strategic racism, it's pretty much how it sounds. It's cold, it's calculating use of racial divisions to pursue one's own ends. And so prior to Trump presidency, when we think about strategic racism, we thought about policy arguments that played on these, again, like what I talked about earlier, these seemingly benign tropes like morality, fairness, personal responsibility, or it was cultural failings of the individuals, most, particularly non-whites, was why they couldn't achieve, or it was the result of an overactive federal government. And so, in some respects, that's no longer the case. Trump has allowed folks not to be strategic, just straight up use the bullhorn. So where they're still able to manipulate existing racial antipathies and ideas of racial differences, which were established during slavery for personal gain. And that's the piece I kind of alluded to with Black conservatives, that, it's one thing to look at the political piece, but I always look at, okay, where's the grift? Where's the opportunism? Because there's always money, personal gain for this. So I'll just stop there.
So can I extend this a little bit and ask you to kind of like compare and contrast, if you will, the university, so there's a Fisher v. University Texas case to the Bakke v. the U.S. Region, California Regents case.
Well, I don't know. Part of me feels like we have a lawyer here. So how about I start the conversation and the lawyer can, then, speak that legal speak. And so, Bakke, and again, Bakke is very similar to Fisher in the sense that here you have an academically unqualified white person blaming, the reason I didn't get into this particular institution is not because of my own failings, but because in the Bakke case, it was these 13 slots that were held for, diversity, but also what the Bakke case didn't discuss, or what they never challenged, was there were also slots held for politically connected students. So and we kind of see what that looks like now with the college admission scandals.
Yes,
so
yes.
Fisher is kind of a very, very similar situation where the more things change, the more they stay the same. And so, where the precedent was upheld, and that's where we, really got the whole color blindness and diversity and compelling interests. And now, but again, it's been the steady march to do away with affirmative action. I'll stop there and ask my colleague, Ms Blakelock, to kind of come in and clean up the mess.
I think you hit the nail on the head, but I think what both of these decisions point to is this movement of the court to enforce what's called a colorblind constitutionalism. So this idea that laws are, again, objectively neutral. And so if you want to get around racism in the courts and the law, then what you do is you don't call it racist. That's essentially the route that they've given. Fisher is particularly interesting because what the court does is they say, you can consider race in these decisions, but it has to survive what they call a standard of strict scrutiny. And what strict scrutiny means is that the court is going to look, most things that go under strict scrutiny fail. Historically, strict scrutiny comes out of the Brown decision. And so the idea was we are going to hold racial like de jure type segregation, claims that are producing racial inequality. We're going to hold them at such a high standard because we know we have this history of racial inferiority in our country. What the Rehnquist court and later have done is reverse that on its head and said, that's going to mean we're not going to consider race at all, which means, famously, John Roberts says, the way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. But like Dr. Donner said, what a lot of these colorblind constitutional theories do is they don't take into account the fact that it's impossible to be colorblind. It's impossible to have a blind admissions policy. There are people who get in on legacy. There are people who get in on just SAT and ACT scores, and even that has its own history of racial inequality. So I don't know if that cleared up or muddied the waters, but
no, thank you so much. Okay, thank you. I just threw in a little bonus there. All right, so Dr. Lynn, this is the final question that I have for you, is that as you well know, there's been many controversies stemming from and possibly around CRT here in the Great Pacific Northwest. Some school districts have banned and later rescinded the ban of flags and symbols of Black Lives Matters and LGBTQIA, while the University of Oregon student leaders are proposing making CRT a required course for graduation. So what will the implications of the CRT tug of war, and more specifically, how will this impact Black professors, Black K-12 educators, Black administrators, Black parents, and most importantly, our Black babies?
Wow, yeah, that's a powerful question. As you started talking about how it's affecting Black professors and Black parents, I started thinking about Oklahoma, and part of what you see in that case is testimony from Black studies professors, for example, who are saying, listen, if Black students, or even if students in general aren't able to learn about the history of race in this country, they're going to come to the University of Oklahoma woefully underprepared, right, to engage in these critical discussions at the university level. And so what we see in that district that shall remain unnamed is, the one that you mentioned here in Oregon, is sort of clamping down on the display of what they call political symbols, right? And they consider the Black Lives Matter flag and the Pride flag to be political symbols. And they have essentially banned them from being displayed in classrooms and being displayed publicly as a way to quell, I think, the discourse around discrimination and how it is experienced by students in the classroom, in the hallways, right, in the community, and in the broader culture, but also as a way to quell and to put a stop to the teaching of these issues. And so, how is that going to impact Black folks? How's it going to impact our society in general? First of all, I think it's a dumbing down of the curriculum. It is a denial of free speech. It limits our self-expression, our freedom of expression, and so I think this affects all of us in really, unfortunately, damaging ways. I think for Black professors who, for example, who are teaching on these topics, those of us who are teaching on issues of race, You know, if our universities are suddenly banned from teaching these topics or have to eliminate these concepts from the curriculum, well, guess what happens to our jobs, even as tenured people, right? Most universities, I can tell you as an administrator, universities have you know, the ability to fire tenured professors in situations where you know, there isn't a department home or something like that for you to teach in. So I think it could be extremely damaging. Now, Oregon does not have state laws banning the teaching of CRT or the teaching of race and or gender or sexuality. What we see in Oregon is a couple of rogue districts that are taking it upon themselves to sort of try to limit the conversation and what they feel is broadly a kind of liberal permissiveness around teaching and discussions about race, class, gender, and sexuality in our state. So Oregon is a little different than Oklahoma and other places where these laws have actually been passed and where the curriculum is being constrained. What you see there are, I think, you know, a group of vigilantes who are very connected with this sort of national network of conservative political activists who are writing this playbook around how you, in fact, eliminate certain conversations from the stratosphere. And one of the ways you do that is through the curriculum and through limiting what teachers can say and what students can do. And so they're essentially following that playbook in an otherwise, I think, liberal environment where, you know, the State Department of Education in Oregon, like the one in Virginia, has made it very clear that we are going to be equity focused and we promote the teaching, we promote anti-racist teaching, and they haven't backed down from that position. But, you know, again, districts in this state have some pretty wide latitude to make their own decisions. I'll just say this before I close. Oregon is a state, and we know this just from living here as Black people, where sort of community governance is very important, right? People fight for their right for local control. And here's an example, and I think, you know, Ms. Blakelock and Dr. Donner can talk about where that has gotten Black folks, right? States' rights, right? And how the state or the federal government has had to intervene on our behalf. And so I think we're in a situation in Oregon where the state is saying one thing, but local jurisdictions are saying another. And as long as local control is the thing, I think we're going to have a wide variety of very different types of experiences across our state. And we see that happening in places like the one you mentioned.
Okay. Thank you for that. So before we transition into questions, I'm gonna bring my brother Carter in here. I want y'all to give some shameless plugs on your books. I know you have some. I can't afford Dr. Lynn's book yet. No, I'm gonna get it. But if you have,
I really like Dr. Donner's work. He has a chapter in this book. So,
so we actually want to promote the work. I know the handbook, the second edition, Dr. Lynn, Dr. Donner's work. I don't have the sports one yet. I want to get that one because I'm a big sports fan. So if you have copies, can you show the audience your books and everything so they can get them? We want to support. I'm a big advocate of making sure that we support and cite Black scholarship. If we don't do it, who's going to do it? So can we get a shot? So let's get Dr. Donner. Let's get a shot of him, and then we'll go to my brother, Dr. So let's show everybody his work right now. So his books.
Yeah, so definitely want to shout out the old work, quote unquote old work. But I want to put in a plug for some new stuff. Me and Ms Blakelock got cooking, which I think is going to be hot fire. And she doesn't know this, but I recently had dinner with the dean of the law school at William and Mary, and I shared with him what we were working on, and he was thoroughly excited, like visibly excited about what we're working on in terms of the Supreme Court and this notion of originalism, federalist society being tools of white supremacy. And so I'll be brief. We're just looking at a couple of key Supreme Court decisions leading up to starting with Brown 2, 1955, all the way up to Parents v. versus Seattle School District Number 1, and just basically how over the years, the Supreme Court has turned Brown into an anti-Black policy. I don't know if you want to add.
Now I feel like you covered most of it, but just kind of like I said a little bit earlier, how we go from Brown to the majority opinion saying the point of this case is to eradicate racial discrimination in schools, to using Brown to invalidate a district decision to try to integrate their schools. So basically how we get there, what kind of legal hoops have to be accomplished over the years, and the role that judges particularly play in that. So not just the Supreme Court as this abstract amorphous thing, but these particular judges being selected by particular networks to push particular agendas.
That is going to be Dylon. Hot fire, like you said, Dr. Donahue.
Oh yeah, hot fire, hot fire.
That's going to be, now that we have you on, go ahead and show those books if you had. I know we want to give so yes, critical race theory education, all right, and the reimagined, okay, so we want to get those books, all of them, and he's gonna dig into the crates, and that one too. So, and we can't pull up all those articles. So get those books. If you really want to know about critical race theory, you got to look at the scholars. So I'm going to go to Dr. Lynn now. I know he has that library back there behind him with all of his books that he's published.
I got one book, and it's an edited book. And like I said, Dr. Donner has a chapter in this, nearly 500 pages though, and this is the second edition of the Handbook of Critical Race Theory in Education. There it is. He's got the first and the second.
Yeah, he got the first one. Yeah.
And Dr. Adrienne Dixon at the University of Illinois is my co-editor of that book. And I think of this as really being a resource for the field. There's a broad range of articles and chapters in here that I think address the foundation of critical race theory. You have a chapter in here by Richard Delgado. You have a chapter by the great Gloria Ladson Billings, and many others who are really looking at what is critical race theory, how is it used in education, right? And that is sort of, I think, giving you, as Dr. Donner does, I mean, if you want to look at sort of first class research in education and that draws on CRT, I think this is a great sort of sampling of a wide variety of approaches. You've got Black scholars, Indigenous scholars, Latinx, Asian American. I mean, so we are very diverse also in terms of how we who we bring to the table. The other thing I want to say real quick, this version of the handbook brings in music, right? So we got a scholar of music education who's talking about racism in the field of music, right? And how that shapes in the field. We have, I'm really excited about the work of Kevin Henry Lawrence at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who talks about charter schools and brings a critical race lens to bear there. And then we also have a new chapter by Subhani Anima from Stanford University, who is articulating this concept of discrit, right? And how, and she compares the experiences of Black boys who are indicated for special education to the experiences of folks like George Floyd, right? And she also talks about where and how for Black men who are, in fact, accosted and sometimes killed by the police. She looks at their sort of educational histories, and you often see a connection and the tie to special education, right? So really, really exciting and interesting stuff going on in
I'll be getting
education.
I'll be getting that edition, everything. I'll get a signed copy.
It's worth it. It's worth it, brother.
Yeah, I listen, I may get it. The holiday season is coming up, so maybe, I don't know if I've been naughty or nice, but hopefully, I could put it on layaway. I'll just play it. I'm gonna get it. I'll make sure you get a signed copy. Okay, enough of that because we plan. Oh, so everybody's plugging stuff. Let me plug my classes. All right, so Post-Racial America in person here at Lane LCC. Go ahead and look it up. I'll be teaching it. We will be doing it from a little bit of a critical race lens. You don't get that too much in undergrad, but you're going to get that because look at all these scholars that I get to borrow from, incite in the work that we're going to do in that Post-Racial America class. Also, multicultural education. Definitely want to check that out. Come in person. So 2 courses I'm going to be teaching here at Lane. You want to sign up and get there. They're going to be a lot of fun. And you see, again, the scholars that I draw from in both of those instances. So with that being said, I'm going to bring in my brother, Brother Carter. I think there's a few questions from the audience that we want you all to address. So I'll let Brother Carter take it away.
All right. Thank you, Brother Rasheed. Hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining. I know you all have been patiently waiting for this Q&A, so let's just hop right into it. But first, I'd like to read an acknowledgement from one of the crowd. It stated that love that the conversation has come to the race wealth gap and its interaction with the legal system. Fantastic analysis. That was from Anonymous. So whoever you are, Anonymous, thank you for your commentary. Okay, so getting into it. First question is from Tracy Weimer. Can you talk about the freedom language being weaponized by the right and left? Now, I am going to do a dealer's choice, and I will let Dr. Marvin Lynn kick off a response. And if you need me to repeat the question, just let me know.
Well, I'll just say quickly, and I'll let my other panelists also jump in on this. That the right is very good at taking the sort of civil rights discourse, the leftist discourse, and turning it into something that they use to their own benefit. We were talking 20 years ago about how who is it? Ward Connolly was using the civil rights language, right, to talk about certain principles that he was more concerned about, and really turning a lot of stuff that I think we have been really concerned about on its face. And so they are very good at that. They study this stuff. They study language. John McWhorter is a linguist, right? And so yes. They actively study linguistic processes in terms of, and they figure out how to use it to their own benefit. And in the case of what's happening right now with CRT has absolutely been weaponized, right? But if you look at the writing of Christopher Rufo, if you look at Christopher Rufo's Twitter page, he tells you that he is in fact weaponizing critical race theory, that he is misrepresenting critical race theory and misusing it for political purposes. He says it in plain language. You don't have to go and do a lot of analysis to figure that out. He's telling you that that's what he's doing. And so it has just been a strategy, I think, to whip up and to drum up fear in the general public to get them to vote a certain way.
Thank you, Dr. Lynn. Ms. Blakelock, I'll let you take it away.
I feel like that was such a comprehensive answer, but as far as the language we use, I think this is another example of some of the benefits even that Black struggle has brought to America. And I'm going to unpack that. What I mean by that is that all of the equality, the equal opportunity, these kind of later movements have to use the language that Blacks used during the civil rights movement. I think particularly some of my research deals with religion, and a lot of freedom of religion cases that have gone to the court, although they're operating under the First Amendment, they use the language that was actually intended for racial equality. So I don't want to, I know we have other questions, so I'm not going to go on a tangent, but I think what Dr. Lynn was saying is absolutely true, is that people know how to use the right languages to get their agenda across.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Connor.
I'll just go ahead and add briefly. If we think about historically, and when I say historically, since this country's founded, the auspices under which this country's founded, freedom has always been weaponized. I mean, that was the tool to justify the quote unquote American Revolution. It was freedom from tyranny of the Great Crown. And so, you know, fast forward to the Civil War, it was the freedom to own Black people. I mean, so freedom has always been weaponized in the advantage, in the name of white supremacy, in the name of white nationalism. Yeah, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Thank you, thank you. All right, and going into our next question from Irene Rasheed. Can the panel explain the difference between actually teaching CRT in K through 12 schools and teaching general history, and perhaps how advantaged populations can separate historical truths from an attack on their modern day individual person, while still bravely facing uncomfortable truths and facing modern day racism and privilege they may benefit from?
I think that Dr. Lynn may have hinted at this a little bit earlier, but most of what is being classified as critical race theory in K through 12 education is more like what I would call cultural sensitivity training in a lot of ways. And so it is bringing in information for minority groups and marginalized peoples that we haven't previously had in the education curriculum. K through 12 students aren't reading Derek Bell. They're not reading Kimberly Crenshaw. I mean, I didn't even read them until I was in my third year of law school. So I think that's an important distinction. But I also think that teaching general history, it's important to have these concepts in general history. So I went to school in the South, and in my textbooks, you know, the Civil War was still referred to as the War of Northern Aggression. And I went to high school. I was in high school only 10 years ago. So if that gives you any like perspective on how far we are from a comprehensive general civics history education that just includes some of the story. So I think with that, I'll pass it on to one of.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's see, Dr. Connor, give it a shot.
Yeah, so I would just add, I always come from the perspective that CRT is a very high level, and you know, not to say that students in the secondary middle school setting aren't capable of understanding, embracing, and engaging with high abstract ideas and high abstract theories. But, you know, the other pieces, I don't see a teacher, secondary, elementary school teacher bringing in a legal case to discuss it. Like, I mean, again, to Ms. Blakelock's point, you know, it's kind of this boogeyman, like, come on, y'all, like, stop lying. Stop, like the title of today, like, stop lying. That, you know, when we, at least for me, when there's a conversation about critical race theory, it has to, you know, we have to begin with the law, and not just the law, but legal cases, constitutional law, major court decisions, and then seeing how that then plays out within society and understanding like what prompted these cases and how did, you know, these cases impact society.
Thank you. And Dr. Lynn, to wrap it up.
Yeah, I think what they said was right on the money. You know, critical race theory is not taught in K-12 schools. You know, I have a colleague, Dr. David Stovall, who's at the University of Illinois, Chicago, who is one of the leading critical race theorists, right? And he has taught high school and still does from time to time. And so when Dr. David Stovall is your teacher, then you are learning critical race theory in the classroom because he has the ability to teach it, right? Because of his background as having gotten a doctorate at the University of Illinois. But by and large, no, it is not taught. And as Ms. Blakelock pointed to, you know, there's been a rich history of teachers trying to grapple with the history, the culture, and the experiences of Black, Brown, and Indigenous kids in the classroom, right? There, you know, Geneva Gay and Gloria Ladson-Billings and Jackie Irvine have talked about this. I mean, you know, about this 40, 50 year, 60-year history of really trying to understand how do we reach all children, right? How do we utilize student culture as a basis for building lesson plans and curriculum? How do we talk about and teach history from the perspective of Indigenous children and Black children, right? How do we do that? And there's been a conversation around that for a long time, ever since there have been schools. So it predates anything that we might refer to as critical race theory. But because looking at history, right? I mean, I thought Ms. Blakelock's example of how slavery has gotten taught, right? That is from the perspective of the enslaver. But if we talk about history from the perspective of the enslaved, then we are going to have to look at it critically. We do have to look at racism and white supremacy, right? And those are things that are also valued by critical race theorists. So yes, they're right in the sense that if we truly look at history from the perspective of those who've been oppressed, we are going to have to talk about some structural issues like racism, white supremacy, sexism, homophobia, and the like, because history is going to prove itself to have represented all of those things in our experiences. And so you have to really limit and narrow the truth, quite honestly, and shut out. You have to erase me from the picture, right? I always tell people, you know, if you want to include me, you have to include my story. And if you narrow my story such that it only reflects your understanding of it, then I'm not really in the picture, right? And so you're eliminating me from the conversation. And that's really what they're trying to do. And it's out of fear. It's probably out of guilt and regret for what has come about. And I think there's a sense that if you teach, if you teach kids the truth, that they're not going to be able to deal with it emotionally. And I think kids can deal with it emotionally. You know, I think everything can be taught developmentally appropriately, but to hide the truth from children out of fear that they're not going to be able to handle it, I think is wrong. And it's just not correct.
Thank you very much. I know we're at time, but I want to squeeze in one more question. This is going to be the final question. And to piggyback from what you said about the youth, this next question applies. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read something from Vicky Nakashima, and I hope I'm reading that correctly. She would like to know how she can learn more about your programs, how she can get access to this recording and your books and information. So just to let you know, and all the other attendees in the audience, this will be posted on our YouTube page for playback at any duration of time. And you can also have information about the panelists, their programs and books. It will be listed with links. But for the last question, this is from Stephen Land. To all the wonderful panelists, the CRT have a place in elementary school education. I believe elementary school students should learn and build some sort of foundation of knowledge on race and racism, but I don't know how in-depth it should be. To Dr. Donner, could you elaborate on what the Obama presidency was foreshadowing?
All right, what a way to go out. I'm going to take the last part of the question that was specifically addressed to me. And so what I mean by the Obama presidency foreshadowing, think about it. When he was elected, we supposedly had entered, quote unquote, post-racial society. You know, race no longer counted as a barrier. You know, it was clear, you know, and the other piece that gets left out of the Obama story was he was the best of the best of the best. First African-American, law review editor for Harvard Law Review. I mean, went to Harvard Law, taught law at University of Chicago, transferred from Occidental to Columbia. Like, he's only moved in the elite spaces. So wife went to Princeton. I mean, so okay, we've entered this post-racial moment, but almost immediately, I won't even call it a backlash. There's a scholar at, she's at Hopkins, sociologist. Vania doesn't know this, but we're going to be using her theoretical frameworks called frontlash, where it's basically like, no, these Republicans, these conservatives, ain't no backlash. They just doing it right in front of your face. And so I just think about it. Like, you have in the State of the Union, someone in the chambers yelling, "You lie." When have you ever seen that in modern history, where the first Black president has been disrespected, and where you have members of Congress saying, our goal is to make him a one-term president. And so you're constantly seeing this. And it was definitely a foreshadowing. It was a foreshadowing. I mean, his Supreme Court nominee, Merrick Garland. I mean, the Republicans were just gangster with it. Like, no, we're not even gonna have a conversation. We're not even gonna have coffee with this man. Really? Like, this is how, and this is where I have to give conservatives, Republicans a lot of credit. They are so wedded to their ideas. Like, compromise is, no. If there's anything worse than a dirty word that can be uttered here, I would ask my colleagues to kind of share that word with me that isn't R-rated or X-rated, but I mean, and so you can't tell me we don't get Trump if we don't have Obama. Like, you just can't tell me that. And so that's what I mean by the foreshadowing, where I think it was a wake-up call for white America. Like, oh, yo, we're losing our country. We known for years we were gonna be the minority. And so here in 2008, this Black man, this Black family is in the White House. He is the leader of the quote unquote free world. It was jarring. It was jarring, more jarring than the O.J. Simpson verdict.
Dr. Donahue, we're not talking about this, but I suspect, and that maybe there's been writing on this, that the insurrection, the modern day insurrection that we experienced, that too was about our vice president, that was really in reaction to a Black being in the White House.
Yeah, you know what? I think you're right. I'm surprised more people haven't talked about that. Great observation, Dr. Lynn.
Yeah, that reminds me, Ta-Nehisi Coates has a book called We Were 8 Years in Power, and his last chapter is titled The First Black President, and his epilogue is The First White President. And he talks about how Trump's election is this kind of direct, it's like a reminder. Like, I don't know if I would call it a front lash, but it's like reminding us that once you think you've gotten 2 steps forward, we're gonna make sure you know that we know you're not. But I wanna talk about the question about how to appropriately teach critical race theory through K through 12 education. So I'm not a teacher. I have practiced law, but I've never really been in the classroom yet. But I have a lot of friends who teach primary and secondary education, especially a lot of my Black female friends, unfortunately no Black male friends who are teachers. But one of the things that they say is that it's really honestly about talking to them at the level that they are at, but also being willing to, one of my friends, she spends a lot of her time outside of the curriculum given to her at the school to kind of expand upon these conversations. So for example, traditionally in their schools, when you're talking about the civil rights movement, it goes, Civil War, Martin Luther King, Harriet Tubman. Like, there are staple people that we talk about when there's a lot going on in between. And actually, in a class I was in recently, we found out that Reconstruction is actually pretty much left out in a lot of curriculums, because middle school history classes go up until the Civil War, and then the 20th century is where high school starts. And so you miss out on this huge moment of our history where Black people were given some of the promises that they were told. So I think one way is just educating yourself, and also just filling in some of the gaps, I guess.
Oh, thank you very much. That was very well put. To all the attendees in the audience tonight, if you wanted to connect more with the panelists, please reach out to Brother Rasheed. Also, we will have their information on our YouTube playback. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Brother Rasheed. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, Brother Carter, for the questions, and thank you for the opening. Panel, thank you. Outstanding job. It was fire. To steal quote from my brother, Dr. Donahue, it was hot fire. Man, yeah, it was all that in the bag of chips. I want to thank our Multicultural Center, my colleagues, our dean, Jennifer Falserano. I want to thank my predecessor, Mr. Evans. That first question came from him. It wasn't actually came under Tracy Weimer, but that was his question. He is our Associate Vice President of Equity and Inclusion. So I want to shout out to that office, and definitely Tracy Weimer for all that she does, and everybody, our BSU, so on and so forth. Thank you for making this panel possible. So with that being said, good night, God bless, peace and hair grease, and I'll see you on the side. All right.